Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the world of gods and myths, where thunder rumbles, lightning strikes, and power seems as endless as the sky itself. Imagine standing at the foot of Mount Olympus, where the air crackles with energy, and you can almost feel the weight of Zeus's mighty thunderbolt. You're about to witness a story of gods, love, betrayal, and epic battles that stretches across the very heavens. But here's the kicker. You probably won't survive this. I mean, you're up against one of the most powerful beings in all of mythology. So, good luck with that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, post your location and local time below. It's always fun to see where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story starts with the king himself, Zeus, the mighty ruler of Mount Olympus, the one whose thunderbolts strike fear into anyone who dares challenge his reign. You see, Zeus wasn't always the unstoppable god we think of today. In fact, his rise to power was far from smooth. Sure, he was the son of the Titan Cronus, but let's just say that family dynamics were complicated. In the beginning, Zeus wasn't even in control of his own fate. Born to Cronus, who had a nasty habit of swallowing his children whole to prevent them from taking his throne, Zeus had a rough start to life. But with a little help from his mother Rhea, who was absolutely done with Cronus's behavior, Zeus managed to escape the family drama and come back swinging. And boy, did he swing, literally. Now, what made Zeus so powerful? Well, that's where the thunderbolt comes in. But it wasn't just for show. This wasn't some fancy light show. No, it was a weapon, a symbol of Zeus's authority and his unrivaled power over both gods and mortals. Think of it like his ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, except a lot more dangerous and a lot more deadly. Zeus needed these thunderbolts not just to fight battles, but to maintain control over a realm full of egos and power struggles. As the story unfolds, you'll see just how many thunderbolts Zeus actually needed. Spoiler alert, it's more than you'd think. But the question remains, why? Why did the king of the gods rely so heavily on these lightning strikes? Was it simply a symbol of power? Or was there something deeper at play? Let's rewind a bit. Zeus wasn't just some mythological figure who woke up one morning with a thunderbolt in hand. He needed that weapon, needed it more than anything else. Not because he was some trigger-happy god, itching to throw a bolt at anyone who got in his way, but because of the fragile balance he had to maintain over the universe. Power isn't just about throwing punches. It's about keeping the peace, managing chaos, and ensuring that the world didn't tip over into total destruction. One of Zeus's biggest challenges was his own family. You see, in the world of Greek mythology, family drama was the drama. The gods weren't just ruling from the heavens. They were all tangled in relationships, rivalries, and betrayals that made even the most soap opera-ish human dramas look tame by comparison. And in the middle of it all stood Zeus, trying to manage a divine dynasty that constantly teetered on the edge of chaos. Take his relationship with his siblings. For example, Zeus's brothers and sisters were a mixed bag of personalities, with varying degrees of power and ambition. There was Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, who preferred to keep to herself and avoid the family drama. Then there was Hera, Zeus's wife, more on her in a bit, who could be both an ally and a fierce rival. And don't forget Poseidon and Hades, Zeus's brothers, who each ruled over the seas and the underworld, respectively. If Zeus didn't keep them in check, the whole system could collapse. But even more complicated were Zeus' many lovers. Ah, yes, love and power, two things that never seemed to mix well. Zeus, the king of the gods, had a lot of romantic entanglements, and every time he fell for someone, it created ripples in the divine world. These weren't just love affairs, they were full-on storms. I mean, imagine trying to rule the world while your wife is jealous of every mortal woman you've ever laid eyes on. Zeus needed those thunderbolts more than ever to maintain some semblance of order. As we'll see, many of these thunderbolts were actually fired in defense of his own kingdom. Sure, they were used to assert dominance in battles, like when he fought the monstrous Typhon, but they were also wielded in situations where Zeus had to protect his loved ones, whether it was saving the world from a flood or ensuring that his children didn't face the same fate as his father's offspring. Every lightning strike wasn't just a flash of power, it was part of a deeper, more intricate dance of cosmic control. But what's even more interesting is that the thunderbolts themselves had a history, one that dates back to Zeus' early days. In fact, they were forged by the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants who lived in the wilds. The Cyclopes were gifted smiths, known for their ability to create powerful, magical weapons. They forged Zeus's thunderbolts as a gift to him when he and his siblings overthrew Cronus. These weapons weren't just tools, they were symbols of his power, crafted with the deepest intention to maintain divine order. Now, let's think about this for a second. The Cyclopes didn't just hand over these weapons without a reason. They understood that Zeus, as the ruler of Olympus, would need more than just brute strength. They recognized that a single moment of divine fury, a flash of lightning in the heavens, could change the course of history. And so, they crafted the thunderbolt to be the ultimate tool for the king of gods. But here's the question that lingers. Why did Zeus need so many of them? Surely, one or two bolts would be enough to strike fear into anyone, right? Well, the answer is more complex than that. You see, power isn't about being flashy. It's about being prepared. Zeus needed multiple thunderbolts because, as we'll learn, his world was constantly on the edge of destruction. He couldn't risk running out of firepower when things got really out of hand. And as the story continues, we'll see just how many times Zeus used these mighty weapons to hold on to control. Sometimes it was to protect the gods. Other times it was to restore order to the human world. But no matter what, the thunderbolt remained his symbol of strength, and the reason why so many myths of Zeus end with the crack of thunder echoing through the sky. So, what's next for our thunderbolt-wielding king? Well, things get even more complicated from here on out. Stay tuned, because this journey through the life of Zeus is only just beginning. So now that you've got the basics down, let's dive deeper into the origins of Zeus's thunderbolt. You know, that weapon he's so famous for. The one that can light up the sky, split mountains, and make gods and mortals alike quiver in their sandals. But where did it come from? Was Zeus just born with it, like some mythical version of a superhero? Or did he have to earn it, just like everyone else? Well, the thunderbolt wasn't exactly a hand-me-down from the family. No, It was forged by the Cyclopes, to be specific. These massive, one-eyed giants weren't just bouncers at the gates of Olympus. They were incredible blacksmiths. They could shape weapons so powerful that even gods would tremble. And these weren't your run-of-the-mill tools you'd find lying around the garage. They were weapons that carried the weight of the universe in their design. When Zeus and his siblings finally managed to defeat their father, Cronus, and overthrow the Titans in the epic Titanomachy, the Cyclopes gifted him the Thunderbolt. It was more than just a tool for battle. It was a mark of Zeus's newfound status. You could say it was like being handed the crown. Except, the crown could destroy a city in seconds. It's important to note that in Greek mythology, weapons weren't just tools. They were reflections of their wielders. They were extensions of their power, and sometimes even their personalities. Think about it. A sword might show strength, but a thunderbolt? That's pure control, pure force, pure dominion over the heavens themselves. Zeus wasn't just a ruler. He was a master of his domain, able to command the elements with a flick of his wrist. That's a level of power few could even dream of. But while the thunderbolt was incredibly important for Zeus, it wasn't the only tool at his disposal. Oh no, Zeus had more than just a shiny lightning rod to help him rule. He had the ability to shape fate itself. Historians still argue whether Zeus truly had the power to change destiny, or if he was simply a servant to it, constantly reacting to the will of the fates. But one thing is certain. Whenever things got dicey on Olympus, Zeus didn't hesitate to throw a thunderbolt or two to get his way. And, as we'll soon find out, he needed them more often than you might think. One of the most dramatic moments that really shows just how much Zeus relied on his thunderbolts is the battle with Typhon, a monster so terrifying that even the gods themselves fled in fear. Typhon was the embodiment of chaos and destruction. Imagine a creature so powerful that it could challenge the very order of the universe. His presence threatened to unmake the world as the gods knew it. And how did Zeus respond? With his thunderbolts, of course. You might think that Zeus would rely on the other gods for help in a situation like this. But nope, this was his battle to fight. After all, who else could take down the creature of chaos but the god of order himself? The battle was fierce, with Typhon using his fiery breath and terrifying strength to try to overpower Zeus. But Zeus stood his ground, wielding his thunderbolts with precision and rage. The battle raged on for days, with the sky flashing bright as lightning struck again and again, pushing Typhon back into the abyss. It was during this fight that we really see how much Zeus needs those thunderbolts. They're not just a flashy weapon. They're his lifeline. Without them, could he have defeated Typhon? Could he have maintained his rule over Olympus? Historians still debate this. Was Zeus truly as invincible as his myths make him out to be? Or did he rely on his thunderbolts as a crutch to assert his dominance? But the importance of the thunderbolt doesn't stop with Typhon. In fact, it was just the beginning of Zeus's many, many struggles to maintain power. You see, power doesn't last forever. Just ask any ruler. No matter how many times Zeus struck down his enemies, with lightning, there were always new threats on the horizon, ones that would test his strength, his authority, and yes, his thunderbolts. There's also something deeply symbolic about the thunderbolt. It's not just a weapon. It's a constant reminder of Zeus's role in the universe. Think about it. Every time Zeus throws that thunderbolt, he's not just asserting his dominance over monsters or mortals. He's reinforcing his connection to the sky, the storms, and the forces of nature. It's as if the very elements are at his command. He is the storm, and that's why he needed so many of them. Zeus had to maintain that connection with the natural world to always show that he was in control. After all, how else could he keep the balance of the universe intact? How could he prove that he was still the king of the gods when every new challenge brought more chaos, more destruction, and more conflict? Now, let's talk about the role that these thunderbolts played in Zeus's relationships. You know, the gods might have been all-powerful, but that didn't mean they had it easy when it came to love and loyalty. And if there's one thing we've learned so far, it's that Zeus was no saint when it came to romance. In fact, he was, well, let's just say, he wasn't exactly a one-woman god. Zeus had many lovers, mortal and divine, and his thunderbolts often came into play when things got messy. For example, when Zeus fell for the beautiful mortal woman, Europa, he transformed himself into a majestic bull to win her over. But surprise, surprise, Hera, Zeus's ever-jealous wife, didn't take too kindly to this affair. Hera was quick to strike, and Zeus had to step in to protect Europa, even threatening Hera with his thunderbolts to stop her wrath. The thunderbolt wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of Zeus's constant need to fight not just monsters, but the very forces of his own family. And let's not forget the time Zeus used his thunderbolts to strike down the Titans in their war for Olympus. While his siblings were involved in the fighting, Zeus's role was to wield the thunderbolt to break through their enemies' defenses, ensuring that his reign would begin without challenge. The thunderbolt was Zeus's way of making sure that the Olympians stayed on top. No one, not even the Titans, could threaten his rule. As we go deeper into Zeus's mythology, you'll see that these thunderbolts are more than just tools of destruction. They're integral to his very identity as the king of the gods. He needed them not just to fight, but to symbolize his absolute power over all things, from the gods of Mount Olympus to the tiniest creatures crawling on earth. But the real question is, how many more times would he need to wield them? And what challenges lay ahead for the god who controls the sky? By now, you've probably noticed that Zeus's thunderbolts weren't just flashy accessories in his wardrobe. They were a vital part of his reign. But Zeus's need for power didn't stop at throwing lightning bolts at monsters or unruly mortals. Oh no, it went much deeper than that. Zeus's struggles weren't only against creatures like Typhon or the Titans. His biggest battles were often closer to home, within his very own family, where the stakes were even higher and the consequences far more personal. Take his relationship with Hera, for example. Hera, Zeus's wife, sister, and eternal partner in drama. If Zeus had the thunderbolts to protect his kingdom, Hera had something just as powerful, her jealousy. Zeus's many, many affairs didn't exactly endear him to his queen. And let's just say that Hera didn't exactly take kindly to the constant stream of beautiful mortals and nymphs Zeus found himself entangled with. Zeus, ever the lover, couldn't help but indulge in his passions, even if it meant stepping on his wife's toes. A lot. And Hera, well, she made sure Zeus's affairs were never easy. Whenever Zeus took a new lover, Whether it was the mortal princess Europa or the nymph Io, Hera would retaliate in the most vicious ways possible. Sometimes she'd turn these women into animals. Other times, she'd send terrifying monsters to hunt them down. But no matter what Hera did, Zeus always had his thunderbolt ready to protect his loved ones. Take the story of Io, for example. She was a mortal woman whom Zeus fell for, as he often did. When Hera found out, she wasn't having any of it. She turned Io into a cow, trapping her in that form to punish her. But Zeus wasn't about to let his beloved be cursed without a fight. Using his thunderbolt, he sent a storm to cover the skies, allowing Io to escape. It's moments like these that really show how Zeus needed his thunderbolts, not just for battle, but to protect those who mattered most to him. But Hera wasn't the only one causing Zeus trouble. Poseidon and Hades, his brothers, had their own ambitions. Sure, they worked together during the Titanomachy, overthrowing their father Cronus. But once the dust settled, the three brothers weren't exactly sharing the wealth equally. Poseidon took the seas, Hades got the underworld, and Zeus got the heavens. But that didn't mean they were content with their share. No, the Olympian brothers were always looking over each other's shoulders, wondering if they could get more. And don't get me started on the Titans, who weren't exactly thrilled with Zeus's rise to power. Even though they were defeated in the Titanomachy, many of the older gods didn't exactly accept Zeus's rule right away. Some, like the Titan Atlas, were cursed to hold the sky on their shoulders, and their resentment festered. Even after the battle was won, Zeus had to keep a tight grip on his rule. One wrong move, one misplaced thunderbolt, and the balance would shift once more. But here's where the thunderbolt really comes into play. You see, power doesn't just come from physical strength. Sure, Zeus had muscle, lots of it, but he also had something that was far more dangerous: his mind. His thunderbolts weren't just for striking down enemies. They were a symbol of his intellect, his ability to control both the physical and the metaphysical. Zeus was constantly balancing forces, dealing with gods and mortals, with natural disasters and family drama. And through it all, the thunderbolt was his go-to tool for asserting control. One of the most intriguing ways Zeus used his thunderbolts was in his role as the arbiter of fate. You see, despite being the king of the gods, Zeus didn't exactly get to call all the shots. The Fates, the three goddesses who controlled destiny, had a hand in everything. They spun the threads of life, deciding who lived, who died, and when. Historians still argue whether Zeus was simply a figurehead in this cosmic game, or whether he truly had the power to alter the threads. But regardless of what you believe, one thing is clear: Zeus never hesitated to use his thunderbolts when he needed to bend fate in his favor. For example, when it came to the Trojan War, Zeus didn't always play an active role on the battlefield. But when things started to spiral out of control, when his influence was slipping, he didn't shy away from using his thunderbolt to make his mark. Zeus may not have been the one throwing the spears, but when it came to deciding the fate of a warrior, a thunderbolt was often his decision-maker. The gods may have played their parts, but in the end, Zeus was the one who had the final say. But beyond the politics and battles, Zeus's thunderbolts also played a role in shaping the world itself. They were a symbol of divine justice. Every flash of lightning, every rumble of thunder, was a reminder to mortals that the gods were always watching, always listening and always ready to intervene when necessary. Zeus was not just a passive ruler, he was a god of action, always ready to strike at the first sign of disobedience or chaos. However, as powerful as Zeus was, even he couldn't maintain that control forever. Eventually, there would come a time when his thunderbolts weren't enough to hold everything together. And that's where the true mystery of Zeus lies. How many times could he use his thunderbolt before it lost its power? Could the king of the gods continue to reign forever, throwing bolts of lightning to keep his kingdom intact? Or would there come a time when even Zeus had to step down? And let's not forget the myths that involve the gods, mortals, and even monsters who stood in Zeus's way. The more he used his thunderbolts, the more he set the stage for future challenges. Every act of divine justice, every battle won, added layers of complexity to the world he ruled over. And with each strike of his thunderbolt, he wasn't just asserting power, he was shaping the very fabric of mythology itself. So, why did Zeus need so many thunderbolts? Because he wasn't just fighting monsters or battling rival gods. He was fighting to maintain order, to keep the heavens, the earth, and everything in between from falling into chaos. With every thunderbolt, he reinforced his role as the king of the gods, as the ruler of both the heavens and the storms. But as we'll see, the more powerful Zeus became, the more he relied on his thunderbolts to hold everything together. And when the time came for his thunderbolts to be tested, Zeus would find himself at the crossroads of fate and power, where even a god as mighty as he could be brought down by the very elements he commanded. Now that we've seen how Zeus used his thunderbolts to establish his power and hold his kingdom together, let's dig into some of the more intense chapters of his reign. Because let's be honest, if you're going to be the king of gods, it's not all feasts and festivals. There are wars to fight, kingdoms to protect, and egos to manage. And Zeus had to use his thunderbolts more times than he probably cared to admit. But it wasn't just for grand battles or vengeful moments. His thunderbolts became a symbol of justice, a way to remind everyone, gods, mortals, and monsters alike, that Zeus was the one in control. One of the most dramatic and high-stakes uses of Zeus's thunderbolt came during the battle against the Titans. The Titanomachy was a 10-year war between the Olympians, led by Zeus, and the Titans, their older, more powerful relatives. The Titans were ancient beings, and they weren't going down without a fight. And so, Zeus wielded his thunderbolts like the ultimate weapon in this clash of titans. Quite literally. During this war, Zeus didn't just have to fight the Titans. He had to convince his fellow Olympian gods to side with him. Poseidon and Hades, his brothers, weren't exactly thrilled with the idea of going to war. Sure, they had their reasons. Poseidon ruled the seas. Hades controlled the underworld, and neither of them was thrilled about being told what to do by the youngest god. But Zeus, ever the strategist, knew that he couldn't defeat the Titans on his own. He needed his brothers on his side. And so, Zeus used his thunderbolts not just as a weapon of destruction, but as a reminder of what was at stake. The gods couldn't afford to lose this battle, and Zeus made sure they knew it. The war was a long and brutal one. It wasn't just about brute strength. It was about divine strategy, power, and the need to prove who was worthy of ruling the cosmos. Zeus's thunderbolts were the key to his victory. With them, He struck down the Titans, sending them tumbling into Tartarus, the dark pit where they would remain imprisoned for eternity. The thunderbolt became a symbol of the change in power, the turning of the tides. Zeus had finally toppled the Titans and secured his rule. But, as you might guess, the battle wasn't over. While the Titans were beaten, they weren't completely gone. Some of them managed to escape from Tartarus, leading to ongoing conflicts. One of the biggest threats came in the form of Typhon, a monstrous creature so terrifying that even the gods fled in fear. Typhon was the embodiment of chaos itself, a creature so vast and powerful that his very presence threatened to unmake the world. And what did Zeus do in response? He grabbed his thunderbolts, of course, but this time, it wasn't just about using them to strike down an enemy. It was about saving the world itself. Typhon's assault was nothing short of apocalyptic. The sky darkened, the winds howled, and the very earth trembled beneath the beast's steps. Zeus, seeing the devastation unfolding, did what only he could do. He used his thunderbolts in a fierce, final confrontation. The battle lasted for days, with Typhon lashing out with his many heads and fiery breath, and Zeus retaliating with lightning strikes that lit up the heavens. Eventually, Zeus triumphed, just barely, and Typhon was thrown back into the abyss. But once again, Zeus needed his thunderbolts to restore order, to preserve the very fabric of the universe. However, with all these battles and conflicts, it's easy to forget that Zeus was also trying to maintain his divine relationships, some of which were, let's say, complicated. There was the endless tension with Hera, of course, and then there were the many lovers Zeus had along the way. Zeus's love life was, well, let's say it wasn't without its challenges. He was famously unfaithful, and every affair seemed to lead to more drama. And this wasn't just any drama. This was divine drama, the kind that could affect the fate of entire nations, let alone the gods themselves. Take the story of Alcmene, the mortal woman who caught Zeus's eye. In one of his many disguises, Zeus visited her as her husband, Amphitryon, and, well, let's just say that their union was a little more than mortal. Alcmene gave birth to Hercules, a son who would become one of the most famous heroes in Greek mythology. But Hera, who was always suspicious of Zeus's infidelities, wasn't too pleased. She decided to make life difficult for Alcmene and her newborn son, setting in motion a series of challenges that would follow Hercules throughout his life. But Hera's anger wasn't just reserved for mortals. When she found out about Zeus's other affairs, her jealousy boiled over into cruel acts against his lovers and their children. This constant strife with Hera became such a major part of Zeus's reign that at times it seemed like he had to choose between his own kingdom and his wife's wrath. And that's where his thunderbolts came in. Every time Zeus found himself in hot water, every time Hera's jealousy became too much to handle, the thunderbolts served as his last line of defense. But Zeus's need for thunderbolts didn't just stem from love triangles and family drama. There were also moments when Zeus had to enforce divine justice. Mortals and gods alike feared Zeus's judgment. It wasn't just that he could strike down anyone with his thunderbolt. It was that he did so with divine authority. Whether he was punishing wrongdoers, guiding heroes, or intervening in wars, Zeus used his thunderbolts to keep order in the universe. It was his way of ensuring that chaos didn't reign, that the delicate balance between mortals and gods didn't collapse entirely. Through every battle, every affair, every moment of divine intervention, the thunderbolt remained Zeus's symbol of ultimate control. But here's the question. Was it truly enough to keep the peace? Was Zeus's power, as vast as it was, truly eternal? Or was he, too, bound to the same fate as all rulers, always at risk of being overthrown, always in danger of losing control? It's a mystery that looms over every myth, every story of Zeus. No matter how many thunderbolts he had, no matter how many times he defeated his enemies, the king of the gods could never be certain of his future. The thunderbolts, for all their might, couldn't protect him from the unpredictable tides of fate. And so, Zeus continued his reign, ever vigilant, ever ready to strike down those who dared challenge his rule. But as we move forward, we'll see that even the mightiest of gods must eventually face the consequences of their actions. And for Zeus, that reckoning might just be closer than we think. By now, you've seen Zeus in all his glory, wielding his thunderbolts to defend his kingdom, control his family, and maintain order in the world. But for all his power, Zeus wasn't just a god of storms and strikes. He was also a god of judgment. And that's where things start to get complicated, because with great power comes the even greater burden of keeping everything in check. Zeus might have been the king of the gods, but that didn't mean he was free from the consequences of his actions or the actions of those around him. And so, we come to one of Zeus's most famous and complex interventions, the Great Flood. Now, in most versions of the myth, Zeus wasn't exactly trying to drown the world for fun. He had a reason. Well, sort of. The truth is, the gods had grown tired of mankind's ways. They had become corrupt, selfish, and morally bankrupt. In short, humanity had forgotten its place in the grand scheme of things. And Zeus was not one to let that slide. But what made this flood so significant wasn't just Zeus's anger. It was his decision to wipe out almost everything. The Great Flood wasn't a small, localized event. It was global, a cataclysmic purge of humanity. It was, quite literally, a fresh start for the world. And Zeus's thunderbolts were a symbol of that cleansing. He didn't just use them to smite his enemies. This time, he used them to set the stage for a new beginning. Historians still argue over whether the flood was purely an act of divine punishment or if it had a deeper, more symbolic purpose. Some scholars believe that the flood was Zeus's way of restoring balance to the world, cleansing it of the sins of humankind so that it could be rebuilt. Others argue that it was more of a temperamental outburst, a moment of divine frustration that had catastrophic consequences. Whatever the reason, the flood became a key part of the mythology surrounding Zeus, showing that even the most powerful gods could be driven to acts of destruction when faced with an unmanageable world. But the flood wasn't the only time Zeus used his thunderbolts to impose his will on the world. Zeus also played a crucial role in the Trojan War, that legendary conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans. You might think that, as the king of the gods, Zeus would have taken a more direct role in the war. After all, it involved his own people. But Zeus was nothing if not diplomatic. And while he didn't always intervene directly, he played a key role in shaping the fate of the war. The Trojan War was a complex tale of love, betrayal, and the whims of the gods. On one hand, you had Paris, the Trojan prince, who caused the whole conflict by choosing Aphrodite as the fairest of the goddesses in exchange for the love of Helen, the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. On the other hand, you had the Greeks, led by heroes like Achilles, Odysseus, and Agamemnon, who all had their own motives for going to war. Now, you'd think that Zeus, being the god of justice and order, would step in and stop the war before it got too out of hand. But that wasn't the case. Zeus had a vested interest in the outcome, and the gods were divided on which side to support. Some, like Hera and Athena, favored the Greeks, while others, like Aphrodite, favored the Trojans. Zeus, as the supreme deity, couldn't just take sides in such a messy affair. Instead, he remained mostly neutral, trying to maintain the balance between both sides. But don't mistake his neutrality for passivity. Zeus didn't shy away from the chaos. Instead, he subtly influenced the course of events from behind the scenes. One of the most notable moments comes when Zeus interferes with the duel between Paris and Menelaus, the Greek king. Zeus, ever the strategist, sends a divine signal to Paris, guiding him in the battle and ensuring that the war would continue. If that wasn't enough, Zeus also had his Thunderbolts ready to intervene at key moments, using them to alter the tides of battle when things were getting out of hand. One of the most significant instances of Zeus's intervention in the Trojan War came during the death of Achilles. Achilles, the mightiest of the Greek warriors, was fated to die at Troy, but the manner of his death was uncertain. It wasn't until Zeus once again used his thunderbolts to guide the events that Achilles met his tragic end. Paris, guided by Apollo, the god of the sun and archery, shot an arrow that struck Achilles in his one vulnerable spot, his heel. Historians and mythologists still debate whether Zeus played a more active role in this death or whether it was simply fate that intervened. But the fact remains that Zeus's thunderbolts were always in the background, shaping the destiny of mortals and gods alike. And then there was the aftermath of the Trojan War. Once the Greeks finally won and the city of Troy was destroyed, Zeus had to pick up the pieces. The gods, who had played such an active role in the conflict, were left to deal with the consequences of their actions. And Zeus, being the ruler of all, was once again left to oversee the restoration of order. But even this wasn't simple. The gods, especially Hera and Poseidon, weren't exactly pleased with how things turned out, and the tensions between the Olympians flared once more. It was in moments like these, moments of profound tension and conflict, that Zeus's thunderbolts truly came into their own. They were more than just weapons. They were a way for Zeus to assert his will, to guide the fate of the world, and to remind everyone, gods and mortals alike, that he was always in control. The thunderbolts weren't just a show of strength. They were a constant reminder that Zeus was watching, waiting, and ready to act when necessary. So, why did Zeus need so many thunderbolts? It wasn't just about fighting battles or punishing wrongdoers. It was about maintaining control in a world full of chaos, about ensuring that the gods, mortals, and all of creation stayed in balance. And as the story of Zeus unfolds, you'll see that this need for balance and the constant threat of chaos would define his reign for eternity. But even a god as powerful as Zeus couldn't hold on forever. And as we move forward in the tale, we'll see that even Zeus' mighty thunderbolts have limits. There will come a time when his power will be tested in ways he can't predict, when the very forces he controls might turn against him. By now, it's clear that Zeus's reign was one of constant struggle, not just against the monsters and the titans, but against the ever-present threat of chaos. As the god of order, he was forever in the business of maintaining balance. Every thunderbolt he threw, every divine intervention he made, was an effort to keep things in check, to prevent the world from tipping into the kind of destruction that would tear everything apart. But what happens when the very forces he controls, love, betrayal, and fate itself, start to slip out of his grasp? And so we arrive at the tale of Prometheus, one of the most iconic stories in Greek mythology, and one that, paradoxically, reveals the limitations of Zeus's power. You see, Prometheus was no ordinary titan. He wasn't just a servant of the gods, content to follow orders. He was a rebel. And in Greek mythology, rebels have a tendency to stir up trouble. But this wasn't some random titan causing a ruckus. Prometheus had a specific agenda. He wanted to give humanity fire. That's right, fire. Now you might think, well, what's the big deal? Why did that matter so much? Well, let's take a moment to think about it. Fire wasn't just a nice to have for humans. It was essential. It symbolized the ability to create, to shape the world, to be in control of one's destiny. And Prometheus, seeing humans struggling in the cold, the dark, and the wild, decided to take matters into his own hands. He snuck into Mount Olympus, stole fire from the gods, and brought it down to mankind. But when Zeus found out, he wasn't exactly pleased. In fact, he was furious. Here's a god who rules the heavens, who keeps everything in order, and suddenly, a titan is giving humanity the very thing that would allow them to challenge the gods themselves. The balance that Zeus had worked so hard to maintain was now at risk. So, in typical Zeus fashion, he responded with fury. He had Prometheus bound to a rock, where an eagle would come each day to eat his liver, a punishment that would continue for all eternity. But Zeus wasn't done. He also created Pandora, the first woman, as a gift to mankind, a gift that would eventually lead to the opening of Pandora's box, unleashing all the evils of the world. It's in this moment that we see how Zeus' thunderbolts, while powerful, weren't the ultimate solution. Prometheus' actions, and the consequences that followed, reveal that even Zeus had his limits. His power was immense, yes, but it didn't guarantee peace or control. The more Zeus tried to assert his dominance over the world, the more he faced the reality that power could never completely safeguard against the forces of defiance and free will. And yet, despite this, Zeus continued to wield his thunderbolts. They were his ultimate tool for maintaining order, but even he couldn't avoid the cracks in his empire. Every thunderbolt thrown, every punishment dealt, seemed to create ripples in the fabric of existence. The gods were not immune to the consequences of their actions. And as Zeus attempted to manage the balance between fate and free will, he often found himself caught in the very storms he created. But let's not forget that while Zeus was busy maintaining order, he was also responsible for upholding justice in the mortal world. This wasn't just a matter of reigning over Mount Olympus. Zeus was deeply involved in the lives of humans, often stepping in to pass judgment on those who crossed the line. And while his thunderbolts were often used as a punishment, they were also a way for him to restore justice when things went wrong. Take the story of King Lycaon, for example. Lycaon was a king who, in his arrogance, decided to test Zeus's divine powers by serving him a meal made from the flesh of his own son. Now, if you were Zeus, would you just let that slide? Of course not. Zeus was, understandably, furious. and in a moment of divine judgment, he struck Lycaon down, transforming him into a wolf as a fitting punishment for his heinous crime. This story is particularly telling because it shows that Zeus didn't just wield his thunderbolts for the sake of punishment. He used them to restore order and right the wrongs of the world. But even here, we see the complexity of Zeus's role. His actions, while just, often led to unintended consequences. When Zeus used his thunderbolts to mete out justice, he wasn't just serving as a god of retribution, he was also dealing with the moral dilemmas of the gods. Could the gods ever be truly just, or were they bound by their own flaws, their own desires, their own chaos? Despite these struggles, Zeus didn't stop using his thunderbolts, and perhaps, in this constant use of power, there was a message to be heard. The more Zeus relied on his thunderbolts, the more it seemed like he was trying to maintain control over a world that was slipping out of his grasp. The world of the gods and mortals was far more complex than any single god could comprehend, and in his efforts to control it, Zeus had created a cycle of intervention and consequence that would continue as long as he ruled. But even with all his power, even with all his thunderbolts, there was one thing that Zeus could never fully control: fate. As we've seen in the many stories we've explored, Zeus may have had the ability to shape the future, but he could never escape the inevitability of the fate that had been woven by the fates themselves. For all his lightning and thunder, Zeus was still subject to the same forces that bound mortals, titans, and gods alike. And as he used his thunderbolts, there was always the quiet understanding that even he couldn't avoid the ultimate end. Zeus was powerful, yes. His thunderbolts were mighty, yes. But in the end, he was still a part of the grand cosmic cycle, a cycle that no thunderbolt, no matter how strong, could break. As we've seen, Zeus's reign was marked by his unyielding need to keep the balance between gods, mortals, and the very elements themselves. His thunderbolts were his ultimate tools, his symbols of authority and power. But as mighty as those bolts were, they couldn't solve every problem, nor could they fix the cracks in the cosmic order that Zeus himself helped shape. It was a delicate dance, one that required constant vigilance, a dance where the stakes were never small. But despite all the power in his grasp, there were moments when even Zeus couldn't control the chaos, and that chaos often came from unexpected places. Take, for example, the Gigantomachy, the great war between the Olympian gods and the giants. You would think that Zeus, armed with his thunderbolts and surrounded by the mightiest of gods, would have had no problem keeping the giants in check. But this battle wasn't about strength alone. It was about the survival of the Olympian order itself. The giants, who were the offspring of Gaia, the earth herself, believed they were the rightful rulers of the world. And they weren't about to let a bunch of gods, no matter how powerful, rule over them. At the heart of this conflict, we see Zeus once again forced to use his thunderbolts to maintain control. It wasn't a quick battle. It wasn't just about throwing a couple of bolts and being done with it. The Olympians fought for days, and Zeus's thunderbolts were instrumental in driving back the giants. However, this wasn't just a battle of physical might. The giants were formidable, but they had an advantage: immortality that made them nearly indestructible. Zeus, once again, was faced with a challenge that required more than just his brute strength. He needed strategy, cunning, and even the help of his allies. And that's where it gets interesting. Zeus couldn't win this battle alone. In the gigantomachy, he had to rely on other gods, particularly Heracles, the great hero. Heracles was the key to defeating the giants. Without him, Zeus's thunderbolts would have been largely ineffective against the giants' powers. It was through a combination of strength, strategy, and divine assistance that Zeus was finally able to secure victory and restore order to the cosmos. But it was a stark reminder that Zeus' power, while vast, wasn't all-encompassing. Even the king of the gods couldn't do it all by himself. This sense of limitation is something we'll see again and again in the myths of Zeus. While he might have been the ruler of the heavens, even he wasn't immune to the unpredictability of fate, nor could he escape the consequences of his actions. And as we've seen with his many affairs, his relationships with both gods and mortals were often complicated, messy, and full of strife. Zeus wasn't a god who could just fix everything by using his thunderbolts. He had to deal with the aftermath of his choices, whether that meant soothing the anger of Hera or managing the fallout from his many romantic entanglements. But let's talk about the role of these romantic escapades in shaping Zeus's legacy. For a god whose power was so vast, Zeus certainly seemed to have a weakness for the ladies, whether they were mortal women, nymphs, or goddesses. One of the most famous of Zeus's affairs was with the mortal woman Semele, the mother of Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry. Their story was one of love, betrayal, and as always, consequences. Semele was a mortal woman who caught the eye of Zeus, and as with many of his mortal lovers, Zeus couldn't help himself. They shared an intense, passionate love affair, but it was doomed from the start. Hera, jealous as ever, decided to interfere. In a fit of rage, she tricked Semele into demanding that Zeus reveal his true divine form to her, something that no mortal could ever survive. Zeus, unable to deny her request, did as she asked, and the result was catastrophic. Semele was burned alive by the sheer power of Zeus's divine presence. Yet, in a twist of fate, Zeus saved their unborn child, Dionysus, by sewing him into his own thigh until he was ready to be born. This tale isn't just a tragic love story. It's also a reflection of the unpredictability of Zeus's relationships. His romantic entanglements often resulted in either the creation of powerful gods or, as in Semele's case, tragedy. For all his thunderbolts and power, Zeus couldn't escape the emotional and moral consequences of his actions. And this story, like so many others in Zeus's mythological legacy, underscores a fundamental truth. No matter how mighty you are, your actions have consequences. Zeus might have been able to strike down enemies with his thunderbolts, but when it came to love and family, he wasn't always in control. But despite the chaos and complications that came with his many love affairs, Zeus was still able to build a legacy that would shape the future of both gods and mortals alike. His children, whether born from his divine relationships or his mortal ones, became some of the most powerful and influential figures in Greek mythology. Heracles, Persephone, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, each of them carried a piece of Zeus's legacy with them, whether it was his power, his wisdom, or his ability to endure in the face of overwhelming odds. And yet, for all his success, Zeus continued to rely on his thunderbolts to protect his kingdom, to restore order, and to right the wrongs of the world. In a sense, the thunderbolts weren't just about power. They were a constant reminder of Zeus's responsibility to the universe. They were a tool that he needed to wield carefully, because with every strike, he shaped the world around him, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad. As we've seen through the stories of Prometheus, the Trojan War, and the Gigantomachy, Zeus's thunderbolts were his most powerful weapon, but they weren't a catch-all solution to his problems. The more Zeus wielded his thunderbolts, the more he became aware of his own limitations. No matter how many times he threw his bolts, no matter how many battles he fought, he couldn't escape the truth that even the gods are bound by the forces of fate, destiny, and consequence. But as we continue on this journey through Zeus mythology, one thing becomes abundantly clear. His story is far from over. No matter the chaos, no matter the turmoil, Zeus continues to reign over the heavens, his thunderbolts flashing across the sky as both a weapon of power and a symbol of the balance he tirelessly sought to maintain. And while his legacy may be one of lightning and thunder, it is also a legacy of constant struggle, a reminder that even the mightiest must keep fighting, keep striving, and keep battling against the forces of the world that never stop challenging them. As we continue down the path of Zeus's storied reign, there's one thing that can't be ignored. No matter how many thunderbolts he had at his disposal, no matter how many wars he won or challenges he overcame, Zeus was still deeply tied to the complex world of his fellow gods. The gods, as mighty as they were, didn't live in a vacuum. Their relationships, whether fraught with love, jealousy, or rivalry, were central to the mythology that defined the Greek cosmos. And at the heart of these divine dynamics was Zeus, the king of the gods, trying to keep his house in order, often at great cost. One of the most fascinating, and at times heartbreaking, aspects of Zeus's rule was his tumultuous relationship with his wife, Hera. On the surface, their marriage might seem like the ideal divine union, two all-powerful gods ruling the heavens together. But beneath the surface, it was anything but peaceful. Hera, the goddess of marriage, family, and childbirth, was far from happy with her husband's actions. Zeus, as we know, was infamous for his countless affairs, which only fueled Hera's jealousy and anger. Every time Zeus fell for another mortal or goddess, Hera would react with fury, often taking out her wrath on Zeus's lovers or their children. The fact that their marriage continued, despite all the tension and turmoil, speaks volumes about the complexity of their relationship and the powerful forces that tied them together. But Zeus wasn't entirely innocent in the matter. He may have had a great love for Hera, but his infidelities were not just small slip-ups. They were full-blown affairs, each leaving behind a trail of emotional damage. In fact, there's a fascinating moment in their relationship when Zeus, in an attempt to placate Hera, actually transforms himself into a humble animal, sometimes a bull, sometimes a swan, to seduce his wife. These moments of vulnerability reveal a different side of Zeus, one that isn't all thunderbolts and power. Despite his dominion over the universe, Zeus was sometimes a god who needed to prove his loyalty, and even to grovel. But Hera's jealousy didn't just end with Zeus's lovers. Her emotions ran deep, and her desire for revenge often led to moments of tragic consequences for mortals and gods alike. Take, for instance, the story of Heracles, Zeus's son, born from one of his mortal affairs. Hera's jealousy of Heracles knew no bounds. She made his life hell, even attempting to kill him as an infant by sending two serpents to his cradle. But despite Hera's relentless attempts, Heracles survived and went on to become one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology. Heracles' journey, though, wasn't just about brute strength. It was also about the divine influence that shaped his destiny. Every trial he faced, every labor he completed, was in many ways a result of Hera's anger and Zeus's attempt to balance his family. Yet even in their most tragic moments, Hera and Zeus were not mere enemies. They were connected by the deep and unshakable bond of family. Despite all the hardship, Zeus would always defend his children, whether mortal or divine. And while Hera's jealousy never fully abated, the strange harmony between them remained, defined by power struggles, passions, and, at times, reconciliation. This constant tension between Zeus and Hera is a reminder of the precarious balance that Zeus had to maintain, not just in his kingdom, but in his personal life. It also points to a larger theme that runs through Greek mythology, the idea that even gods were subject to the same emotional turbulence, the same faults, and the same inevitable struggles as mortals. Even the mightiest gods couldn't escape their own desires, flaws, and the consequences of their actions. And yet, for all the divine drama that unfolded on Mount Olympus, Zeus still had his hands full with maintaining the stability of the world itself. This wasn't just about family squabbles or romantic entanglements. This was about managing the fate of the cosmos. As the ruler of the sky, Zeus had a responsibility to keep the natural world in balance. The winds, the storms, the seasons, all these forces were under his control. But nature itself wasn't always cooperative. There were times when Zeus had to step in to prevent nature from spinning out of control, to maintain the cycle of life and death that kept the world turning. Take, for example, the story of the seasons and the tale of Demeter and Persephone. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest and fertility, had a daughter named Persephone, whom Zeus had an important role in the fate of. When Persephone was abducted by Hades to become his queen in the underworld, Demeter grieved so deeply that she stopped the earth from producing crops, leading to widespread famine. The gods were desperate to restore balance, but it was Zeus who had the final say. His decision to allow Persephone to return to her mother for part of the year and spend the other part in the underworld created the cycle of the seasons, balancing life and death, growth and decay. In a way, this story mirrors the struggles Zeus faced in his own realm. Just as Demeter and Persephone had to share the earth between two worlds, one of life and one of death, Zeus himself had to navigate between opposing forces, order and chaos, love and anger, peace and war. His reign was not just about sitting on a throne and watching the world go by. It was about managing the constant push and pull of these forces, making decisions that would ripple out to affect both gods and mortals alike. And while Zeus was certainly a god of power, he wasn't an all-powerful god. His need to constantly intervene in the world, whether through thunderbolts, punishments, or divine decrees, revealed a deeper truth. Zeus, for all his might, was part of a much larger cosmic system, a system governed by forces beyond even his control. Just as he could control the heavens, but not always the hearts of his fellow gods, Zeus was ultimately at the mercy of fate, something no thunderbolt could strike down. At the end of the day, Zeus's need for thunderbolts wasn't just a reflection of his power, it was a reflection of his struggle to maintain order, his struggle to manage his relationships, his struggle to balance the natural forces of the world. And as the god who sat at the top of Mount Olympus, Zeus's thunderbolts were more than just tools for destruction. They were tools of survival, of justice, and of balance. They were his way of keeping the world in check, no matter how many times it threatened to slip into chaos. But even the most powerful gods can't keep the world from unraveling forever. As we'll soon see, the cracks in Zeus's reign would continue to widen, and even his mighty thunderbolts might not be enough to prevent the world from changing forever. As we draw closer to the end of Zeus's reign, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The king of the gods, for all his thunderbolts, divine wisdom, and cosmic authority, could not escape the natural flow of time. The world he ruled, the very heavens, the earth, and the underworld, was ever changing, and with every thunderbolt he hurled, every divine decision he made, he helped shape a world that was destined to change, whether he liked it or not. His reign wasn't just one of thunder and power. It was a reign marked by the inevitable passage of time, by the changing roles of gods, mortals, and the very forces of nature. Let's start with the inevitable, the end of the gods. The Greeks, like many ancient civilizations, were obsessed with the cyclical nature of time, the idea that nothing lasts forever, even the gods. This concept of divine mortality, or at least the eventual fading of gods from the world, was present in many myths. Zeus, as the supreme god of the Olympians, represented the peak of divine power, but even his reign wasn't immune to the changing tides of fate. As Zeus aged, as the world evolved, the gods of Olympus had to confront the reality that their power was not eternal. In some stories, we see hints of the rise of new deities, new powers that would gradually overshadow the old ones. While Zeus was the undisputed ruler of Mount Olympus, he couldn't stop the inevitable rise of newer, more human-like gods, gods that were more relatable to the people who worshipped them. This shift is most evident in the shift of focus from the gods of Olympus to the more complex, humanized deities of later myths. Even in the world of the gods, change was the only constant. But for now, Zeus's reign was still in full swing. Yet, the cracks in his seemingly perfect kingdom had started to show. The once united pantheon of Olympian gods had begun to splinter. The gods' relationships with one another were becoming more strained, and all the while, Zeus was still holding on to the reins, trying to keep everything in order, even though the threads were starting to fray. As the king of gods, Zeus wasn't just a figure of immense power. He was also the keeper of the laws that governed the universe. His thunderbolts were more than just instruments of power. They were symbols of his authority to enforce divine law. But what happens when even the gods themselves fail to follow the laws they are supposed to uphold? What happens when divine justice becomes corrupted or imbalanced? That's where the real story of Zeus's legacy lies. Take the case of his son, Ares, the god of war. Ares was a symbol of brute force, conflict, and destruction. Everything that Zeus, as the god of order, would ideally want to control. Yet, despite being the god of war, Ares was never quite in the position of power that he should have been. His actions often led to chaos, and his aggressive nature was a source of constant frustration for Zeus. Ares, who should have been one of Zeus's most loyal allies, often found himself at odds with the rest of the Olympians. And in these moments of conflict, Zeus's thunderbolts, his tools of divine retribution, weren't always enough to resolve the situation. But what if Ares wasn't the real problem? What if the real issue lay in the nature of Zeus' leadership itself? You see, as powerful as Zeus was, his power wasn't absolute. He was a ruler, yes, but he was also a part of a much larger cosmic system that had its own rules. And in some ways, Zeus's reign mirrored the challenges of any ruler, trying to balance power, justice, and family, while maintaining order in a world full of unpredictable forces. Even Zeus couldn't avoid the inherent flaws in his leadership. And then there was the matter of the humans. The very creatures who were meant to be under Zeus's rule often seemed to defy him at every turn. Time and time again, mortals challenged the gods, sometimes with good reason and sometimes with blind arrogance. In the stories of mortals, like Odysseus and Perseus, we see humans who, while humble and flawed, manage to outwit gods through wit, cunning, or sheer willpower. These mortals' success stories were an unwelcome reminder to Zeus and the Olympians that the gods were not the ultimate rulers of the world. In many ways, mortals held the true power, the power of unpredictability, resilience, and free will. And let's not forget about the famous figure of Prometheus, whose rebellion against Zeus we touched on earlier. The Titan's actions were a reminder that even gods have their limits. Prometheus didn't just steal fire to give humanity a chance. He acted out of a deep belief in the potential of mortals. In doing so, he created a divide between the divine and human realms, one that even Zeus couldn't ignore. Prometheus's punishment, bound to a rock and tortured for eternity, was Zeus' way of enforcing order and showing his authority. Yet, in a bitter twist, Prometheus's defiance also proved that there was a world outside of the Olympians' control, a world where the gods were not all powerful. The truth was this: Zeus could not forever keep the world in his grasp. The gods' hold on the heavens, the earth, and the underworld was tenuous at best. Even with his thunderbolts, Zeus could only do so much. The balance of the universe was always in flux, and nothing, no god, no mortal, no power, could hold sway forever. Zeus's need for thunderbolts, then, becomes more than just a tool of physical strength. They are a reminder of his vulnerability. Each thunderbolt he wielded was an attempt to stave off the inevitable, to fight back against the tide of change that would eventually come for him, just as it had for the other gods before him. His thunderbolts were his attempt to remain relevant in a world that was constantly shifting, a world where even the gods couldn't escape the passage of time. And in the end, the thunderbolts of Zeus, while powerful and symbolic of his reign, could not halt the inevitable changes that would come. Time marched on, as it always does, and the gods of Olympus, like all things, would eventually fade into myth. Zeus may have been the ruler of the heavens, but even he couldn't stop the tides of fate. And as the thunder rumbles in the distance, we are reminded that even the mightiest of gods must eventually face the end. The world will continue to change, the gods will come and go, and the thunderbolts of Zeus will fade into history. But the stories we tell, the legacy of a god who wielded lightning as his sword, will remain. The end of Zeus's reign wasn't some dramatic moment of downfall. No mighty battle in which his thunderbolts fell silent. It was more subtle, a slow shift as time worked its inevitable magic on both gods and mortals. The gods, despite their power and their long-lasting rule, were not immune to the forces of change. As the gods of Olympus faded into myth, their reign slowly gave way to new ideas, new gods, and new powers. The thunderbolts that once cracked through the heavens now seemed like relics of a past age, symbols of an era that was long gone. But Zeus was still Zeus, one of the most powerful beings in existence. And even as his role in the cosmos began to change, his legend lived on. His thunderbolts may have been a symbol of his reign, but they were also a symbol of his undying presence in the world of myth. They represented not just the physical power that Zeus wielded, but the very essence of what it meant to be a god in the world he ruled. Yet, as with all things, the gods had to adapt, and Zeus, despite his unshakable position at the top of the divine hierarchy, was not impervious to the changes taking place in the world. Mortals, those very creatures he had once ruled over with iron authority, were becoming more powerful in their own right. The rise of great mortal heroes, like Alexander the Great, whose ambition and conquests spread across the known world, showed that mortals could shape history just as much as gods could. The influence of the gods began to wane in favor of more human-centered stories and legends. But still, even in a world that was moving away from the gods, Zeus's thunderbolts held a lasting power. The thunderbolts weren't just tools of destruction. They were a representation of Zeus's role as a symbol of divine justice, a cosmic force that maintained order in the universe. The thunderbolts might no longer strike down monsters or punish those who defied the gods, but they still represented something larger. They were a reminder that power, even when it seems to fade, never truly disappears. It simply changes form, and as the age of gods slowly slipped away, Zeus's legacy continued to echo through the ages. His story became one of mythology, of great power, but also of vulnerability. Despite his immense strength, Zeus couldn't escape the inevitable tides of fate. As the gods slowly gave way to the heroes and the humans who shaped the future of the world, Zeus' thunderbolts became something else, a legacy, a reminder of the gods' time, and a powerful symbol of the battle for control between order and chaos. But what happened to Zeus after the thunderbolts were no longer needed to keep the world in check? Was there ever a time when the king of the gods was truly at rest? Or did he continue to watch, waiting for the next storm to strike? The truth is, the answer remains shrouded in mystery. We don't know for certain what happened to Zeus after the height of his reign. Some myths say that the gods slowly retreated from the mortal world, taking their divine influence with them. Others suggest that Zeus, though no longer the supreme god, continued to watch over the world from Olympus, his thunderbolts still crackling in the distance, a symbol of his undying power. Perhaps in the end, Zeus's story wasn't meant to have a neat conclusion. After all, his entire reign was marked by conflict and struggle, by a constant need to maintain balance in a world teetering between chaos and order. Maybe the ultimate lesson of Zeus's life is that power, no matter how great, is always temporary. Even the mightiest thunderbolt can be lost to time. And perhaps that's what makes his story so compelling. The idea that even the king of gods, for all his thunderbolts and eternal reign, was still subject to the natural forces of change and destiny. As we reflect on the reign of Zeus, it becomes clear that his thunderbolts were much more than just weapons. They were representations of the delicate balance that gods, mortals, and all of creation had to maintain. Zeus was the ruler who tried to preserve that balance, but even he couldn't stop time from slipping through his fingers. Now, as we close this chapter, we return to the thunderbolts themselves. They may no longer roar across the sky with the same frequency, but their legacy remains. They were Zeus's declaration of power, his unwavering symbol of control. And though Zeus may no longer be the king of gods in the way he once was, his thunderbolts will forever remain a part of the mythic world, a reminder that even in the face of great power, all things must eventually change. As the skies quiet and the last echo of thunder fades into the distance, we are left with the quiet understanding that Zeus, like all great rulers, faced his time, his struggles, and ultimately his end. But his legacy, the story of the thunderbolt-wielding god who ruled the heavens, will never truly fade. For even as the storms settle, the memory of Zeus, the king who commanded the skies, will always linger in the stories we tell. And with that, we end our journey through the myths of Zeus. The thunder may have quieted, but his legacy remains, a reminder of the power of the gods, the fragility of control, and the never-ending struggle between order and chaos. With the story of Zeus drawing to a close, we find ourselves at a moment of quiet reflection. After all the thunder, all the battles, all the divine struggles, what do we really take away from the reign of the King of Gods? Perhaps it's not just his power we remember, but the fact that even gods, no matter how mighty, must contend with the passage of time, the consequences of their actions, and the ever-present forces of fate. Zeus, the ruler of Mount Olympus, was not immune to these truths, and in many ways, the story of his life and reign is a reminder of the impermanence of even the greatest powers in the world. Despite all the challenges Zeus faced, his battles with the Titans, his struggles with his own family, the complex relationships with the other gods, and his constant attempts to maintain control over the chaotic forces of the universe, he remained, to the very end, a symbol of divine authority. His thunderbolts may have been his most iconic weapon, but they were also a representation of his constant effort to keep everything in balance, to impose order on a world filled with strife and disorder. And while Zeus may have eventually faced the fading of the gods' influence in the mortal world, his thunderbolts still resonate with us today. It's easy to think of Zeus as a god of brute strength, of constant action, of unstoppable force. But as we've seen throughout his story, his power wasn't just in his thunderbolts. It was in his role as a leader, a protector, and even a judge. Zeus's reign was a delicate balance between upholding divine law and navigating the complex world of family, betrayal, love, and loss. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a ruler who understood that his power wasn't just about force, it was about influence, diplomacy, and the ability to make difficult decisions that affected the entire universe. And yet, despite all his wisdom, Zeus was still flawed. His infidelities, his decisions that led to suffering for mortals and gods alike, and even his over-reliance on his thunderbolts, all pointed to the same truth, that even the most powerful beings are not immune to weakness. Zeus, for all his divine authority, was ultimately a god subject to the same forces of fate and consequence that governed the lives of mortals. His thunderbolts might have struck with divine fury, but they couldn't protect him from the inevitable march of time. But that's the beauty of the story of Zeus. It's not just a tale of power, it's a story of struggle, of the human experience, even in the divine realm. The gods, like mortals, faced challenges that tested their strength, their resolve, and their ability to adapt. They fought, they loved, they betrayed, and they suffered, just like us. And Zeus, despite all his might, was no different. He fought to protect his kingdom, but he also fought to keep his own identity intact, to maintain his sense of purpose in a world that was constantly changing. In this way, Zeus's thunderbolts weren't just a symbol of his power, they were a symbol of the constant effort required to maintain control. Every lightning strike, every thunderous roar, was a reminder of the effort that goes into preserving order in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. Zeus's reign may have been filled with conflict and turmoil, but it was also a testament to his unwavering desire to protect and preserve what he had built. His story, at its core, is a reflection of the challenges faced by anyone in a position of power. The constant battle to hold on to control, to make the right choices, and to face the consequences when those choices fall short. Even as the gods receded from the mortal world, even as their influence waned, Zeus's legacy lived on. His thunderbolts may no longer strike the heavens with the same fury, but they remained a part of the mythological fabric, a reminder of the time when gods walked among men, when power was not just about might, but about maintaining balance in a chaotic world. And as the thunder fades and the storm clouds part, we are left with the quiet understanding that the power of Zeus, like all great forces, was never absolute. It was fleeting, it was bound by the limits of time and fate, but it was also undeniably profound. The thunderbolts that once split the sky were symbols of Zeus' role in the grand scheme of things, an ever-present reminder that even the gods must face the consequences of their actions, the passing of time, and the inevitability of change. So, as we close the chapter on Zeus and his thunderbolts, we remember the god who ruled the heavens, who faced down monsters, and who wielded power with both wisdom and fallibility. Zeus may not have been the eternal king of Olympus, but his story, his thunderbolts, and his legacy will continue to echo throughout time. Now, as you drift off to sleep, remember that the world is full of storms, both literal and metaphorical, but also filled with the possibility of change, of growth, and of transformation. Just as Zeus wielded his thunderbolts to shape the world around him, so too can we shape our own futures with the choices we make and the power we hold within ourselves. As we approach the final chapters of Zeus's story, we must step back and take in the full scope of his reign. We've witnessed his glory, his thunderbolts lighting up the sky, his power over gods and mortals alike. Yet, despite his might, Zeus was never an omnipotent ruler, immune to the complexities of existence. Like all who hold power, his reign was shaped by the struggles and sacrifices he faced along the way, the alliances and betrayals that tested him, and the very weight of time itself. But as his legend reaches its zenith, we must reflect on one final truth. Power is a fleeting thing, even for gods. Zeus may have commanded the heavens and wielded lightning, but he was far from invincible. One of the most enduring themes in his story is his vulnerability, not in physical terms, but in his relationship with the ever-changing world around him. While the thunderbolts were a symbol of his control over nature, fate, and justice, they were also reminders that even the gods were bound by forces greater than themselves. The Fates, the three goddesses who spun, measured, and cut the thread of life, were the ultimate masters of the universe. beyond even Zeus's influence. And while he may have bent the fabric of time and fate to his will, he couldn't escape their final judgment. Take, for example, the tale of Achilles, the hero who, though favored by the gods, was ultimately destined to fall. Achilles was the epitome of divine favor, strong, near invincible, and beloved by Zeus. Yet, despite all the strength and protection the gods granted him, he was still vulnerable to the whims of fate. The arrow that struck him in his heel, leading to his death, was not a divine thunderbolt from Zeus. It was a mortal weapon, guided by Apollo, another god, but one that proved that even the mightiest hero had a limit. Achilles, for all his greatness, was still bound by destiny, and no matter how much Zeus intervened, he could not rewrite the fated end of his son's life. In these stories, we see the deeper meaning behind Zeus's reign. He was, as we have discussed, the god of order, the enforcer of cosmic justice. But in the grander scheme of things, even his thunderbolts, mighty as they were, could not escape the inevitability of fate. Zeus was not the master of the universe in the way he might have hoped. His rule was bound by limits, both personal and cosmic, that not even his thunderbolts could overcome. Yet, despite these limits, Zeus's reign also served as a lesson. His thunderbolts, his mighty interventions in the world, were not only a sign of his power, but of his responsibility. As the ruler of the gods and the heavens, Zeus wasn't simply a passive king. He took action when action was required, whether it was punishing the Titans, battling Typhon, or guiding the course of human history. His leadership was not defined by his ability to control everything, but by his willingness to step in when necessary, to wield his power in the service of balance. One of the most compelling parts of Zeus's story is his relationship with mortals. While the gods of Olympus often lived in their celestial realms, untouched by the struggles of human life, Zeus was different. He took an active interest in the affairs of men and women, and while his thunderbolts were often used to punish mortals for their transgressions, they were also used to protect them, whether by guiding heroes like Perseus or Odysseus on their quests, or by intervening in the battles of great wars. Zeus was a god who understood that his power was not an end in itself. It was a means to an end. His thunderbolts were not simply tools of destruction. They were tools of guidance, of protection, and of justice. Yet, despite his many acts of heroism, Zeus' relationship with mortals was often fraught with tension. Mortals, unlike the gods, were bound by time. They had limited lives, and their actions, no matter how heroic, were always subject to the whims of fate. This constant reminder of the fleeting nature of mortal life was a source of both strength and sorrow for Zeus. On one hand, it gave him purpose to protect and guide humanity in their brief lives. But on the other hand, it reminded him of the impermanence of even the most powerful of beings. Mortals, for all their flaws, were destined to pass, just as the gods would eventually fade from memory. And in that moment, we understand something fundamental about Zeus. His reign, though mighty, was never meant to be eternal. It was an era, a moment in the grand sweep of history that would eventually give way to new rulers, new powers, and new myths. Zeus was, in many ways, a product of his time. His thunderbolts, his divine interventions, were born out of a world that was constantly in flux, a world that was never static, never unchanging. His story, like the thunder he wielded, was a flash of brilliance in an ever-changing sky. And while that brilliance would eventually fade, the legacy of Zeus, the lessons he taught about power, responsibility, and the fragility of existence, would remain. As the years passed and the stories of the gods became myths, Zeus's role as the king of Olympus transformed. He became a symbol, not of an active god intervening in the world, but of an idea that even the most powerful must eventually yield to the forces of time, fate, and change. But in his fading, Zeus's story remained one of the most enduring in all of mythology. His thunderbolts might no longer light up the sky, but the lessons of his reign, the need to balance power with responsibility, the inevitability of change, and the fragility of even the mightiest of beings, continue to echo in the stories we tell today. Zeus's legacy, then, is not just in the thunderbolts he threw, but in the way he shaped the world and the gods who followed him. He was a ruler, yes, but also a reminder that power, no matter how great, must be used wisely, for even the gods must face the consequences of their actions. The thunderbolts of Zeus were not only tools of justice, but also symbols of the delicate balance that holds the universe together. They were a reminder that even the greatest of kings, even the mightiest of gods, must eventually let go, and that the world will continue, with or without them. As the storm finally clears and the echoes of thunder fade, we are left with a world that has been shaped by Zeus, but not defined by him. The legacy of the King of Gods is one of power, yes, but also of vulnerability. In the end, even the mighty Zeus could not escape the inevitable pull of time and fate. And in that truth, we find a quiet understanding that even in the greatest of storms, there is always the possibility of calm, of change, and of new beginnings. As the final chapters of Zeus's reign draw near, we see a god who has shaped not only the heavens, but also the very essence of mythology itself. His thunderbolts, once so mighty, are now memories woven into the fabric of legend. But even as his era fades into myth, Zeus remains one of the most complex and enduring figures in the pantheon of gods. His reign, full of power, conflict, and divine drama, leaves us with timeless lessons about the nature of leadership, the fragility of power, and the inevitable passage of time. Zeus, like all rulers, had his flaws, his constant struggles with his own family, his repeated infidelities, and the emotional consequences of his actions were not just the marks of a powerful god, but the marks of a ruler who was humanized by his relationships with others. Even in the immortal world of the gods, the lines between strength and weakness, love and betrayal, justice and revenge were never clear-cut. The gods of Olympus were not perfect. They were as vulnerable to the forces of time and emotion as mortals were, perhaps even more so, for they had eternity to contend with. Yet, through it all, Zeus remained the cornerstone of Olympus. His thunderbolts were not just instruments of destruction, but tools of order. They were symbols of the god who kept the balance between chaos and cosmos, a reminder that power, while fleeting, can leave a lasting legacy. Even as his world grew more complex, as new heroes rose to prominence, and the god's influence waned, Zeus continued to embody the eternal struggle for control in a world that was constantly changing. But it is this very struggle that makes Zeus's story so compelling. For every thunderbolt he cast, there was always something beyond his reach. His relationships with mortals and gods were fraught with tension and consequence. His divine interventions were often necessary, but never without cost. And while his power was undeniable, it was clear that even he was subject to the forces of fate, destiny, and time. The gods of Olympus were, in the end, just like the world they ruled, a world full of contradictions, where light and darkness coexisted in a delicate dance of order and chaos. Yet Zeus, with all his complexity, teaches us something important. His reign wasn't about absolute control, it was about balance. And in the same way that his thunderbolts struck with precision, they were also reminders of the balance between creation and destruction. Power isn't about domination, it's about maintaining equilibrium, navigating the complexities of the world, and knowing when to act and when to let things unfold. Zeus was a master of this balance, even if he didn't always get it right. His actions, both noble and flawed, are a reflection of the challenges that come with leadership and the weight of responsibility that power brings. But despite the challenges, Zeus's influence endured. His legacy is woven into the very fabric of mythology, and his thunderbolts, though no longer thrown with the same force, continue to resonate in the stories we tell. These stories, full of heroes and villains, gods and mortals, reflect the same struggles Zeus faced: the pursuit of justice, the struggle for control, and the inevitable passage of time. As we look back on Zeus's reign, we see a god who wasn't just a ruler of the heavens, but a figure who embodied the complexities of existence itself. He was both the force that kept the universe in motion and the reminder that even the greatest forces must eventually give way to the tides of fate. His thunderbolts were a symbol of his power, but also of his vulnerability. They were both his strength and his weakness, the very thing that defined him as a god. And as we move forward into the future, we carry with us the lessons of Zeus, lessons of power, responsibility, and the understanding that even in the face of great might, no one can escape the pull of destiny. And so, as the sky clears and the echoes of thunder fade, we are left with a final, quiet truth. Zeus, though he may no longer be the reigning god of Olympus, continues to live on in the myths, in the stories, and in the lessons he left behind. His reign may have ended, but the power of his thunderbolts, the power of his story, will never truly fade. And in that way, Zeus, the king of gods, will always be remembered. And so, as we near the conclusion of our journey through the life and reign of Zeus, we pause to reflect on what remains of the king of gods. His thunderbolts may no longer crack the sky with their terrifying force, but the echoes of his reign continue to shape the stories we tell. His legacy, one built on both triumph and tragedy, is etched into the very fabric of mythology. Even in his fading, Zeus remains a towering figure, a symbol of divine power, but also a cautionary tale about the limits of that power. When we think of Zeus, we often think of his strength, his dominance over the heavens, and his ability to strike down any who defied him. But as we've seen throughout his story, his greatest challenges were not against the titans, the monsters, or even the mortals who dared challenge him. They were within himself, his relationships with his family, his role as a father, a husband, and a ruler, all served to highlight his complexity. He was not just the god of thunder, he was a god of balance, of justice, and of mercy. He was a god who was deeply aware of the weight of his actions and the consequences they would have, not only on those around him, but on the very world he sought to control. In the end, Zeus's story is a reflection of the human experience itself, his struggles with love and betrayal, his battles against chaos and disorder, and his efforts to maintain control in an ever-changing world are universal themes that resonate with us all. We may not wield thunderbolts or rule over the heavens, but we too face the forces of fate, the challenges of responsibility, and the complexities of our relationships with those around us. Like Zeus, we must learn to navigate the balance between power and vulnerability, between action and inaction, between creation and destruction. Zeus's thunderbolts, which once held the power to strike fear into the hearts of gods and mortals alike, have become more than just a weapon. They have become a symbol of his eternal struggle. They are reminders that even the greatest powers must face their limits, that even the gods must answer for their actions. In a world where nothing is permanent, Zeus's story teaches us that power is not just about strength. It's about the responsibility that comes with it. His thunderbolts, while destructive, were also tools of justice used to maintain order in a world that was always teetering on the edge of chaos. As time passed, the gods of Olympus faded into myth, and with them, the reign of Zeus. But his legacy lives on, not just in the stories we tell, but in the lessons they impart. We remember Zeus not for his thunderbolts alone, but for the wisdom, the struggles, and the imperfections that defined him. His reign may have ended, but his impact on the world, both divine and mortal, will never be forgotten. The thunderbolts may no longer crack the sky, but the storm they once brought continues to shape the world we live in. And so, as the clouds part and the last rumblings of thunder fade into the distance, we remember Zeus, not as a king who ruled the heavens, but as a god who, in his own way, helped shape the world we know today. In the end, Zeus's story is not just a tale of divine might, but of the power of myth to endure, to evolve, and to remind us of the fragility of even the greatest powers. He is a god whose thunderbolts, though quieted, will forever echo through time, a symbol of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, power and responsibility. Now, as we close this chapter, we take with us the story of Zeus, not just a god, but a legacy. His thunderbolts, once a force of unimaginable power, have become the stuff of legend, a reminder that even the gods must face the consequences of their actions, and that no power, no matter how great, can escape the passage of time. As you drift into sleep, let the storm of Zeus's story wash over you, a reminder that the world, like the thunderbolts, is full of energy, power, and change. And in the quiet aftermath, may you find peace, knowing that even in the face of the most mighty forces, balance can be restored, and the world can continue to turn. As we reach the final stretch of our journey through the life and legacy of Zeus, it's fitting to reflect on the most fundamental aspect of his reign, the concept of legacy itself. The thunderbolts, the mighty interventions, the sweeping victories, all of these are impressive, yes. But what truly endures is not just the physical might of Zeus, but the mark he left on the very fabric of existence. After all, the reign of a god isn't measured only by how many enemies they vanquish or how much territory they control. It's measured by how they shape the world after their time has passed. In the end, Zeus's thunderbolts may have been weapons of incredible power, but they were also symbols of something far greater. They represented his capacity to act decisively, to impose order, and to confront chaos head on. But they also symbolized the responsibility that comes with power. Zeus wasn't just a god who struck down his enemies. He was a god who understood that power wasn't about domination. It was about balance, and the very fact that he used his thunderbolts to enforce justice, to protect his people, and to maintain order shows that his reign was about more than just might. It was about ensuring the harmony of the world. But this balance was never perfect. Zeus, for all his wisdom and strength, was also subject to the same forces of fate and time that governed the rest of the universe. The gods of Olympus, for all their divine power, were not immune to the ebb and flow of the world. And as the stories of Zeus unfold, we see that even the mightiest of beings must eventually yield to the forces of change. Zeus, the ruler of the heavens, was bound by time, by fate, and by the very forces of nature he sought to control. His story, while filled with triumph, is also one of humility. Zeus knew that no god, no ruler, could remain at the top forever. Even his thunderbolts, the ultimate symbol of his power, could not shield him from the passage of time. His reign was destined to give way to new stories, new gods, and new powers. Yet in his fading, Zeus's story teaches us something important: the value of change, of growth, and of the inevitability of transformation. His reign wasn't eternal, but the lessons it imparted are timeless. And while Zeus may no longer be the active ruler of Olympus, his legacy continues to live on in the stories we tell. The Thunderbolts, once instruments of divine retribution, have become symbols of the divine struggle, the eternal dance between order and chaos, power and vulnerability. They remind us that even in the face of the most overwhelming forces, balance can always be restored. But there's one more thing about Zeus that stands out, and it's something that resonates with all of us. Despite his godly stature, Zeus was not perfect. He was flawed, vulnerable, and often conflicted. He wasn't immune to temptation or weakness, and his story is as much about the consequences of his actions as it is about his victories. This is perhaps the most humanizing aspect of Zeus, that he too faced the complexities of leadership, love, and loss. And in this, Zeus is a reflection of the very struggles that we all face in our own lives. In the end, the most powerful thing Zeus ever wielded wasn't his thunderbolts, nor his authority, nor even his divine intellect. It was his ability to learn, to grow, and to continue to fight for the balance that he believed in. It's the same quality that makes all great leaders, both mortal and immortal, so compelling. They are not defined by their victories alone, but by how they face their challenges, by how they learn from their mistakes, and by how they continue to move forward in the face of adversity. As the myth of Zeus concludes, it becomes clear that his reign was not just about the heavens and the earth. It was about the eternal struggle between chaos and order, between power and responsibility. And though Zeus's reign on Mount Olympus may have ended, the story of his thunderbolts, of his victories and defeats, of his leadership and flaws, will continue to live on in our imaginations, in our culture, and in the hearts of those who still look to the gods for inspiration. Now, as the storm of Zeus's story fades into the distance, we can rest assured that his legacy remains, carved into the timeless myths that have shaped our understanding of power, justice, and the delicate balance that keeps the universe in motion. The thunderbolts may have quieted, but the lessons of Zeus will continue to echo through the ages. And so, as you drift off into a peaceful sleep, remember that no matter how powerful or mighty one might seem, the real strength lies in understanding the impermanence of all things and the responsibility that comes with power. Just as Zeus's thunderbolts light up the heavens, so too can we find moments of clarity and strength in the storms of our own lives. And when the storm passes, we can find peace in knowing that we, too, are part of a larger story, a story that continues long after we've fallen silent. As we close the journey through the life and reign of Zeus, the legendary thunderbolts may no longer roar, but his story will forever remain alive in myths and legends. While Zeus's power was mighty and undeniable, it was the challenges, contradictions, and lessons about responsibility and change that truly made his story immortal. Zeus was not just a god wielding absolute power with lightning bolts. He was a leader who constantly fought to maintain balance in a world of constant upheaval. Though he faced mistakes, complicated relationships, and difficult choices, these very aspects of his reign humanized him and showed that even a god must contend with his own limitations. And in the end, the greatest lesson we can learn from Zeus is the recognition that power is not eternal, but the decisions and actions we take can leave a lasting legacy. Though the thunderbolts no longer light up the sky, the story of Zeus, his strength, and the challenges he faced will continue to inspire us. So, as you drift into sleep, remember that just like Zeus, we too have the opportunity to make an impact in our own lives. Though the journey may not always be easy, perseverance and responsibility will always help us find balance and peace in an ever-changing world. May you have a peaceful sleep, filled with beautiful dreams. And like Zeus, may you always seek balance in your own life.